So we've had 2 gospel readings already. So for the third reading, I want you to sit down. It's a little bit long. Today in the homily, I want to talk about the problem of evil, how bad things happen in our world. And so I've chosen a reading that addresses this. And this was an essay that I wrote 5 weeks ago on the 25th of March, dealing with the origin of evil. And in the homily, I'll unpack that in much more detail. We are all bite-sized pieces of God, small-scale fractals of source. But like little children who insist, I want to do it myself, we take the newly emergent pieces, self-awareness, free will, and freedom, and attempt to develop our budding divinity. Free will is the sticky part. It necessitates there being choices among which to decide. But the choice originally was not between good and a pre-existing evil, but rather where to land on the spectrum of service to self at one end, let's call it A Street, and service to other at the other end, let's call it B Street. It's necessary at the start of one's life to make many choices at the A end for food, air, warmth, attention. Otherwise, the little infant would not survive childhood. But if we camp out there, survival morphs into selfishness, which morphs into greed, which morphs into fear, anger, and eventually violence. Evil has then arrived. We did not make a choice for a pre-existing evil, and God certainly did not create it. Evil then is an emergent phenomenon, an energy that comes into being and coagulates into a solid state from living at the A end of the spectrum. Like all energies, it is contagious, and others are quickly lured into its embrace. Eventually, even entire communities and future generations are affected. Babies are then born into a world in which evil is a major player. It spreads quickly and reaps both global and even cosmic harvests. That is the real meaning of original sin. And suddenly, creation, which was birthed only through love, has its elements rearranged into a configuration that breeds odoriferous evil. I want to illustrate it with a few metaphors. The first one I'll use is a jigsaw puzzle. Each soul is a fractal of God, a scaled-down model with all of the same pieces and features of which Source herself is composed. But each soul insists on being presented with the final image separated into all its constituent parts so that I can do it myself. However, if I make poor decisions while I attempt to assemble the pieces, I will wind up with a buckled puzzle that has lots of gaps and many pieces left over. It won't look anything like the original. If I work the puzzle correctly, then I will reproduce exactly the image of God. It's important to note that the buckled version with the gaps and the extra pieces did not exist before my attempts. I wasn't choosing to do it like that because God had previously made that version available as a possible outcome. Second metaphor, water. 2 animals drink from a lake in East Africa, one a cow and the other a snake. They drink the same water, but the cow turns it into milk to nurture its calf, while the snake turns it into venom to kill its adversary. Likewise, it's the way humans process their experience that will wind up nurturing others or killing them. But the experience itself, the water, is pure love. Evil was not a pre-existing creation of God, but rather a wrong reworking of its elements. Number 3, the violin. One of my grandfather's favorite poems was The Touch of the Master's Hand, in which an old discarded violin is being auctioned off for a pittance until an old man approaches the auctioneer and asks if he may play a tune upon it. The old man, the master, plays it so beautifully that it brings tears to the eyes of the entire attendance. When the auctioneer restarts the bidding, he is now getting offers in the thousands of dollars. Another person without any musical talent might have produced utter cacophony had he attempted a tune. The violin was made to midwife great music, but in the grip of the amateur, only discord emerges. Good music is what the violin was made to produce. Cacophony does not exist until the amateur gets involved. Number 4, the artist. I'm sure that many of Fra Angelico's contemporaries had access to the self-same palette of colours that he had. But I'll hazard a guess that for every one of his masterpieces, other painters produced visually blah or even repugnant canvases. It's the person holding the brush that determines what will emerge. So finally, a word about emergence. Emergence is what happens when the total is greater than the sum of the parts. It is never predictable from examining the separate pieces. For example, for the longest time in cosmic evolution, both hydrogen and oxygen existed separately. However, when molecules of hydrogen and oxygen began to date and to marry, suddenly a brand new substance that had never existed before emerged. We call it water. That's what happens when you get the jigsaw puzzle right. When Timothy McVeigh orchestrated the Oklahoma City bombing on April the 19th, 1995, he simply combined 2 commercially available products, ammonium nitrate and nitromethane fertilizer, to produce an emergent substance that killed 168 people. That's what happens when you get the jigsaw puzzle wrong. Evil is not a piece created by God and tossed into the crucible of incarnation to separate the wheat from the chaff. It is a brand new emergent phenomenon created by those who live permanently on A Street. Words inspired by God. Poop is a 4-letter word. But I come from a different culture, so I'm not quite sure if it's acceptable to use that instead of, it's a synonym, another 4-letter word. But in order to talk about the homily today, I'm going to have to use the word poop, because one of the best articulations, a very funny characterization of how different religious systems and different philosophies treat the problem of evil. So I'm going to substitute the word poop for the other one. Taoism, poop happens. Confucianism, Confucius say, poop happens. Buddhism, if poop happens, it's an illusion. Zen Buddhism, what is the sound of poop happening? Judaism, why does poop always happen to us? Christianity, if poop happens, it's your own fault. Hinduism, this poop happened before. Atheism, there is no poop. Nihilism, who cares if poop happens? Seventh-day Adventism, poop never happens on a Saturday. And Jehovah's Witnesses, knock knock, who poops? So it's very funny, it's a characterization, but you know what? It goes to the core of how different religious systems and different philosophies regard the problem of evil. And that's what I want to talk about today, the problem of evil. Yeah? So I'm going to make just 3 main points this morning. I'm going to give a little bit background to the problem, how the problem emerges in the first place. And then secondly, I'm going to talk about a historical review. I'm going to go in more kind of a serious look at how the great religious systems treat the problem of evil. And then I'm going to start unpacking this was the essay that I wrote just 5 weeks ago, because I think it's, for me, it's a new insight of me into the origin of real evil. So there are the 3 points I'll make this morning. So the first one, a little bit of background to it. When about 70,000 years ago, that Homo sapiens transformed into Homo sapiens sapiens. It happened just about 70,000 years ago. Homo sapiens had existed for about 200,000 years. So we were thinking beings. Homo sapiens literally means wise one. So we were wise, we could think, but we couldn't think about thinking. We didn't have language skills. And language is the ability to manipulate symbols intracranially in order to think about abstract possibilities. So that only arrived on the scene about 70,000 years ago. We became Homo sapiens sapiens. And once we developed that skill, we began to try to make sense of the world in which we found ourselves. And when you try to make sense of the world, what you do is you assimilate a whole bunch of data, and you try to identify some putative patterns in the data that will allow you to form hypotheses. And it allows you eventually to try to predict outcomes. If you can recognize patterns, then you can begin to predict outcomes. And then eventually, hopefully, the idea is that you can actually learn to control the outcomes, not just predict them, but to control them. So we started wrestling with these notions. We tried to make sense of everything that happened around us. And so either we were built in the image and likeness of gods, who gave us that faculty, or we created gods in our own image and likeness using that faculty. But very, very definitely, the first two things that Homo sapiens sapiens attempted to do was to imitate the dwelling places of the gods and the behavior of the gods. And so all the temples, all the shrines in all the religions were efforts on the part of human beings to try to recreate where they believed that the gods lived, the kinds of dwelling places in which the god lives. That was the first thing we began to imitate. Secondly, we started to try to imitate their behavior. So all moral codes and all ethical systems come out of a perceived notion that laws were either given us by the gods or we think that this is how the gods were actually living. So that's how it gets started. But as we developed the ability to recognize patterns, the thing that really made it very difficult for us that we couldn't figure out was the greatest problem in theology is called theodicy. It's a problem of evil. Why do bad things happen? It was very, very difficult to figure out any kinds of patterns to how bad things happen. It stymied us for a long time. And there are three components when you begin to examine this question. The first thing is you have to learn, how do you define bad things? How do you define evil? And there are various categories of evil. So for instance, natural disasters, floods or earthquakes or volcanoes or, they're bad things, but, how do you predict them? You can't predict them very, very much. And who's responsible for those? We attributed, that's the gods. The gods are doing that kind of stuff. They're upset for some reason or other. So that's a bad thing that everybody can recognize. Somebody gets killed in a flood, really bad thing. The second kind of category of bad things that happen have to do with the human person. So we age, we get sick, we die. And so again, there's this, who's responsible for that process? That some people get sick, some people die at the age of 11, some people die at the age of 95. So who's responsible for this? And we attribute this to the gods as well. So they're responsible for two kinds of evil. And then there's a third category for which we're responsible ourselves. We call it crimes, or in religious language, it's called sins. So sins are somehow where you break the law or you create hurt for somebody else, and human beings are the origin of that. So there's three kinds of origins. And the third great question, once you figured out, what categories of evil exist and who's responsible for each category, is how do you deal with it? What do you do about these things? And we figured out ways, the stuff that the gods are responsible for, you can learn to pray, or you can offer sacrifice. You can hope to calm them down a little bit. And as far as human behavior is concerned, you can create norms and ethical belief systems or moral codes or whatever. So this is how we try to address the issue. So that's just a kind of a background to it. Now with that as the background, I'm going to go through some of the major spiritual systems, and I'm going to emphasize here that I'm going to treat maybe 14 or 15 of these very quickly. So there is no way I can do justice to any of those systems. I'm going to just reduce it to a few simplistic notions to give you an overall trajectory. But obviously, every one of these systems is infinitely more complex than I can deal with right now. So bear that in mind as I go through these things. So I'll start with the great Sumerian civilization that goes back about 6,000 years. And the Sumerians believed that they were manufactured or genetically modified by a group of extraterrestrials called the Anunnaki, who came from a planet called Nibiru in a different solar system. And that they came to planet Earth about 445,000 years ago, and they took an existing hominid and they genetically modified it to make a slave race that then eventually became Homo sapiens, and then with some more modifications, Homo sapiens sapiens. And these gods, had a very, very ambiguous relationship with their creation. So there are two main divinities. There's a lot more than that. But there were two main gods in the Sumerian system. One guy called Enlil and the other guy called Enki. And Enlil, had no time for this human creation. They were far too noisy. And finally, when his own people, the gods, started interbreeding with human beings, he felt that was it, that's it. They've gone too far at this stage. And he orchestrated a flood to wipe everybody out. The other god, his half-brother Enki, who had created human beings or genetically modified the hominid, decided, no, I'm going to save my creation. And he saved it with a character called Utnapishtim, which is the equivalent of Noah in the Hebrew version. So he saved the human race. So there's this warring goes on between different gods. So evil then is the result of the gods, coming down. So you find again and again and again, when gods come into the picture, and you're trying to understand the problem of evil, you see four things again and again and again in every culture that posits the existence of gods. And the first one is that evil is because either the gods are punishing us for some misdemeanor, or evil is just collateral damage. When the gods are warring among themselves, we are kind of the fallout, the collateral damage that happens. Or sometimes it's a lesser god, who's displacing his anger. Like daddy comes home drunk and he hits little Johnny, and Johnny goes out and he kicks the dog. And so some big god beats up on some little god, and the little god comes down and he beats up on human beings. Or the fourth way is that we're simply imitating their behavior. The gods actually, behave in an atrocious fashion. They kill each other, they steal, they pillage, they rape. And so we're just imitating what they do. So again and again and again, when you find you're looking to kind of a spiritual system or religious systems, if you take mysticism out of the equation, when you look at just pure religion and there are gods involved in it, you'll find again and again and again that one of these four explanations is how they treat the problem of evil. Either the gods are punishing us, or it's collateral damage, or it's displaced anger, or we're just imitating what the gods are doing anyway. So that was kind of, when you look at the Sumerian legends, that's what you find there. You go to Hinduism, and I have to say, obviously, that personally, I believe Hinduism is probably the most complete, mystical, spiritual tradition I've come across. But I'm going to get in very, very short terminology, just in a few statements, talk about the religious part of Hinduism as distinct from the mystical part of it. It's a very, very sophisticated system. But in Hinduism as well, you have the notion of the devas and the asuras. And the devas are kind of the good guys, and the asuras are the bad guys, the demonic forces. And there's a war that goes on between those, even with very sophisticated aircraft that are called vimanas. So again and again, you get the same notion. Once gods are in the equation, we're either getting punished by them, we're collateral damage from them, it's displaced anger, or we're just imitating what we see them doing. So obviously I'm not doing justice to the mystical level of Hinduism or any other system. But once you get gods in the equation, that's what tends to happen. You go across to China, you look at Confucianism. Confucius lived about 500 years before Christ. And he came up with this extraordinary system. Arguably, Confucius was the most prophetic, or the greatest teacher of all time. His teachings influenced about a third of the world's population for 2,500 years. So if you look at the quantity of people who came under his influence and the longevity of the system, you could argue he was the most successful teacher of all time. And he posited that a human being is actually an illusion. Your sense of separate self is an illusion created by the sum of your social roles. That every human being is in a web of 5 relationships. He called them the 5 constant relationships. The first one is the relationship of husband and wife. The second is parents to children. The third one is elder brother to younger sibling. The fourth one is teacher and pupil. And the fifth one is subject and emperor. So every one of us is involved in these 5 constant relationships. And the sense of separate self is actually an illusion created by the sum of the social roles. So evil enters the equation when you dishonor any one of these 5 relationships. Or if you dishonor the ancestors. There's not a whole lot of talk in Confucianism about gods per se, but there is about the ancestors. So honoring the ancestors is very important, and dishonoring the ancestors introduces evil to the equation. So evil comes in one of 2 ways. You dishonor the ancestors, or you break out of these 5 constant relationships and they tend to be egocentric. The Buddha lived roughly around the same time as Confucius. And the Buddha realized that any talk about the gods, in some sense, is meaningless. You can't be sure of anything. You can only be sure of what your mind is doing. So he chose to focus on how you understand what the mind is doing and how you can get control of the mind. So he talked about all suffering is dukkha. And dukkha is an analogy from an axle, a wheel which is slightly off the axle. When it's lunging along, it's creating a whole bunch of noise and friction. So dukkha, or suffering, is a result of some kind of misalignment, where either through attachment or aversion, we create this suffering for ourselves. So it's literally orchestrated and comes into being through the mind. And so Buddhism, and again I'm being really simplistic here, getting control of the mental processes is the key to the letting go of suffering. So that would have been the Buddha's great insight into that. Around the same time, or maybe a little bit before, of the Buddha and Confucius, was a character called Zarathustra, sometimes known as Zoroaster. And Zoroaster was a prophet in Persia. And Zoroaster had reduced the plethora of divinities down to 2 gods. In previous systems, polytheism meant that there were literally hundreds of different gods, often warring with each other or having responsibility for various human activities like art or lovemaking or agriculture or warfare. He reduced them down to 2 characters, a god of light and a god of dark. The god of light is called Ahura Mazda, which we get our Mazda light bulbs, that's where it came from. And Ahriman is the god of darkness. And there's this cosmic, titanic struggle going on between the god of darkness and the god of light. And so all evil comes from, the fallout from that interaction. Now, Zoroastrianism had a huge effect on Judaism. Between the years 598 BC and 529 BC, the last 2 tribes of Israel were taken into exile by the Babylonians. And while they're there, they come under the influence of the Persian Empire and the Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. And in fact, it's the Persians who set the Hebrews free. They conquered the Babylonians in 529 BC and set the Israelites free to go back into the land of Israel. But in the meantime, during the 70 years that they lived in exile, the Hebrews came under the influence of this extraordinary system. And much of the Hebrew scriptures is the result of stuff they learned from Zoroastrianism, particularly their wisdom literature. And the archetypal one is the book of Job. The book of Job started out as a simple little Semitic story. It's only 3 chapters. But when you look at the book of Job, it's 42 chapters. So chapter 1 and 2 and chapter 42 are just a simple little story about somebody who was very misfortunate, lost his kids, lost his property, got really, really sick, and finally God restores everything. But the 39 chapters in the middle are a reflection, a psycho-spiritual reflection, on the problem of evil. And after many, many hits at it, finally, the result is that God finally says to Job, who in God's name are you to question me why I'm doing stuff? Were you there when I created the world? When I said to the sea, thus far shalt thou come and no further, were you there watching that? When I made the 4 winds of the heaven, were you there for that? Finally, Job just cringes and realizes that there's only one answer to the problem of evil. Close your mouth, don't ask questions, be a good boy, and God will then reward you. And God rewards Job. So this was the first effort. The Jews go back from exile to their own land, and now, for the first time ever, they've developed monotheism. Moses was not a monotheist by any stretch of the imagination. Moses lived about 1250 BC. The very first commandment that Moses gave the people was, first, I'm the Lord your God. You're not allowed to put other gods in front of me. He was not a monotheist. He was advocating monolatry, which is very different. Monolatry is the worship of a particular God, not the belief that there is only one God, but choosing one God and making a covenant with that God. So after the Babylonian exile, they will become true monotheists, believing in the existence of only a single God. But they didn't believe in life after death. Now, if God is one, and God is good, and there's no life after death, it means that everything has to be either rewarded or punished in the here and now. And so they looked around and they said, obviously, the following people are beloved of God, and they're being blessed by God, and the following people are being cursed by God. So the ideal human being was Jewish, male, healthy, and wealthy. They were marks that you were particularly beloved of God. So if you were missing any of these, if you were Jewish but a female, you weren't quite the full shilling. Or if you were Gentile, tough luck. Or if you were Jewish and male but you weren't wealthy, you were in poverty, because obviously God is punishing you in some fashion. And so that was the notion that gets carried forward down to the time of Christ. The ideal person is Jewish, male, healthy, and wealthy, because God is blessing them, because there's no place else to get blessed or to get punished. Now into the scene comes this extraordinary teacher, Avatar teacher, Jesus Christ. Totally coming out of the Jewish tradition. A carpenter, a full-time carpenter and a part-time preacher. And he comes into the equation, how then is it that Jesus isn't hanging around with healthy people or wealthy people or even males a lot of the time. He's hanging around with women, even prostitutes. He's living with the unhealthy, sick, sinner type. He even visits the Gentiles on occasion. So if the ideal man being blessed by God is male and Jewish and healthy and wealthy, what does that say about Jesus and his ministry? So he's got a totally different hit on the problem of evil. Totally different hit. He advocates to his own disciples. He says, you must be like your heavenly Father. He causes his sun to shine on the good and the bad alike. Doesn't differentiate between them. He causes his rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike. You must not differentiate. Do not judge at all, in fact. And you will not be judged. And so Christ is advocating unconditional love. That evil, as I will say in my essay, is the result of when unconditional love is not offered to the situation. So Jesus will have a totally different hit on the problem of evil, from his contemporaries. The only place where evil enters into the equation significantly is the belief system that all illness is occasioned by demonic entities. And so very, very often, he'll cast out demons. So the belief system was that even illnesses, physical illnesses and psychological illnesses are the result of some kind of either demonic possession or demonic infestation or demonic influence. So that will still be part of his cosmology at that stage. Out of this then will come Roman Catholicism. And obviously Roman Catholicism, or early Christianity, is one of two twins born to Judaism, which was being put to the sword by the Roman Empire after the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, after a 4-year siege. So the dying mother gave birth to twins. One is a kind of normative Judaism, and the other is Christianity. They're both children of the same mother, as far as I'm concerned. So Christianity takes up and is hugely influenced by its Jewish origins. And so how will Christianity regard this problem of evil particularly? They will look and see that there's definitely a Satan, there's some kind of satanic figure who's influencing people, but that we create a lot of it ourselves through breaking laws. And what are the laws? If you're a Roman Catholic, there's 10 commandments of Moses you have to keep. There's 6 commandments of the church. You must never miss Mass on Sunday. You must never eat sausages on Friday. You have to become a member of the church because extra ecclesiam nulla est salus. Outside the Catholic Church, there's no redemption. So you've got to be one of us, a baptized member of us, who doesn't eat meat on Fridays, doesn't miss Mass on Sundays, keeps the 10 commandments of Moses and the 6 commandments of the church. And then you're in. And evil happens when you break any of these things. So that'll be the kind of the Roman Catholic, simplistic view of it. Protestantism will spin off a few versions of this. So mainstream Protestantism will go back to the Jewish notion that when you're healthy and wealthy, it's because God is blessing you. So you look around you and you see some poor homeless character, lying in the corner, wrapped up in cardboard, and it's obviously his own fault. He should get up off his ass and find a job. So in mainstream Protestantism, you have the same notion that somebody who is sick or poor, that obviously God is punishing them for some sin they've committed. A second version was even more devious, Calvinism. John Calvin had the belief system called predestination, where a very, very sick God created souls whom he predestined for hell. It's not that God created a whole bunch of souls, and he predestined people to get to heaven, and then by default, some people got left out and went to hell. According to Calvin, he actually created souls to be predestined to go to hell for all eternity. Now, can you square that God with the God of Jesus, whom Calvin allegedly was following? So that's a really, really sick notion, that evil comes in because a psychopathic divinity is creating souls to be tortured for all eternity to satisfy his own kind of craziness. A fundamentalist version of Protestantism would claim that unless you accept Jesus as your personal Savior, you can't be saved. So their version of evil is that people refuse to convert and become Christians and accept Jesus as their personal Savior. Now, obviously, I'm being very simplistic, but that's kind of the core message there. You look at Islam, and the great sins in Islam, there's a demonic character in Islam as well, whose name is Shaitani. It's the very same word in Swahili. And Shaitani, and there are other evil forces called the jinn, from which we get the kind of the comedy version in Hollywood of Genie, or the genie in the bottle. But the jinn were kind of evil spirits as well. So they're influencing it. And the sin in Islam is refusal to convert to Islam. So it's like Catholics believing outside the Catholic Church there is no salvation, and fundamentalist Christians believing that unless you believe in Jesus as your personal Savior, the Islamic version is either you convert to Islam or you go to hell for all eternity. And so, again, you get really kind of very different notions of what constitutes evil. You look at stuff like, say, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, go back again 600 BC, and they had a plethora of divinities as well, who were constantly at war with each other, and interbreeding with human beings on a regular basis, capturing human women and interbreeding with them. And you get the very same four things again. You have evil then as punishment from these guys, or as collateral damage, or as in imitation of them, or as displaced anger. I'm going to bring up then somebody like an extraordinary genius called William Shakespeare, who in my opinion is one of the three great psychologists I've ever read, the other two being the Buddha and Jesus Christ. In the 1500s, Shakespeare would say stuff like, there is nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so. So he's very, very Buddhist in his thinking. That is the mind that's creating these categories. It's decisions of the mind that create the notion of good and evil. And then, of course, you get a modern atheism that claims it's just a random shoot. There is no pattern to it. So trying to predict where it's going to happen or not is kind of meaningless. All you can try to do is try to see, weather forecasting, try to change the weather patterns, intervene, put chemtrails in the sky, pollute our waters, destroy our fields with artificial fertilizers and pesticides and weed killers and whatever. And look what they've bequeathed us. So in atheistic, materialistic science, their attempt to try to create patterns and take control of nature has left us in the sorry state in which we find ourselves right now. And I have to say this by way of political commentary, that in our country right now, what is evil? How is the evil defined in our country right now? And it seems to me, evil in our country is increasingly being defined as unconventional thinking. If you think outside the box, you're bad. You're not patriotic anymore. If you disagree with the agenda of the oligarchy, you're introducing evil into the equation. If you don't accept the fake news which is propagated by the mainstream media, there's something wrong with you. You're a bad person. So more and more, we get redefined what evil looks like. So that's kind of a very, very quick historical sweep. So for the third point then, I just want to examine this essay that I wrote 5 weeks ago. Because for me, it represented a whole new understanding of the problem of evil. As I've tried to show, mostly we can agree what constitutes evil. We can all agree that, catastrophic, natural events are some form of evil. We can all agree that getting sick and aging and dying is some form of evil. We can all agree that human behavior, criminal activity, is some kind of evil. Now, the question then becomes to whom is this evil attributable? And obviously, if you're religious, God has to be involved in some fashion with it. If you don't believe in God, then it's a total random process. But when Judaism finally came up with the notion of there being only one God, they solved one huge problem, but they created a bigger problem. Because it's understandable that if we live with many, many, many gods, then evil can be easily understood. These guys are making war with each other, and we're the fallout. But if there is only one God, and this God allegedly is good, where does evil come from? How can you have evil in a world in which there is only a good God who created all that is? So if God really created everything, and he gave us free will, the thinking goes, he must have created evil as a possibility. Otherwise, free will is just meaningless. We're just robots pretending to have free will if, there's nothing to choose between. So that's the big problem with the theology. If there is only one God, and God is good, and God is the origin of all that is, then obviously God somehow must have created evil. And all of the monotheistic religions have wrestled with this issue again and again. And that's what I was wrestling with 5 weeks ago with my meditation. I can't believe that God actually created evil in order to give us something to exercise free will. Otherwise, we'd be robots. That didn't make any sense to me. And so here was my thinking, that there's not a pre-existing evil, and a pre-existing good, and free will allows us to exercise itself by choosing one or the other. I don't believe that that's the answer. Here's what it looks like to me. There is only God. There is only love. But at some stage, in order to garnish experiences, God self-fractured. The image I've used many times before is like, imagine a colony of bees with 30,000 members. And they're operating as a monad. A monad is an organism that operates as an individual. So a human being is a monad. If I walk over here, every part of me walks over here. I don't leave my tush behind me. I operate as a unit. It's called a monad. So imagine that a hive of bees had to operate as a monad. So every morning, it has to squeeze itself out through the door of the hive and fly off and try to land on some flower and get pollen or nectar. Maybe only a very big flower would work because it would weigh it down. So what do? They break themselves up into 30,000 members, and they go off in different directions. And if they have a radius of 3 miles, then pi r squared tells you they can cover 27 square miles of territory between the 30,000 of them. And they land on maybe 40, 50, 60, 100, 200 flowers. And they come back then with millions of experiences and stories. And they come back to the hive, and they're not just storing the nectar and the honey, they're telling yarns to each other. See, you can't believe what I saw today, or what I experienced today. And they share the stories. Now, in some sense, mystically, obviously that's a metaphor just, that's what God does. God self-fractures. Judaism will call it the sephirot, the little light beings, the little pieces of consciousness. And every one of them is a fractal. It contains the totality of the divine, of original unity consciousness. It contains all of it. But it's broken up into a myriad of pieces. And the object of the exercise is when any one organism develops the following 3 characteristics. It develops self-awareness. It's aware of itself as an entity for the first time ever. It develops free will, the ability to make choices, and it develops the ability to love unconditionally. When these 3 things come into play, you're very, very, very close to realizing your inner divinity, those 3 pieces. The problem is, how do you configure these pieces? And so the only original choice when God self-fractures is where will an individual speck of consciousness land on the following spectrum. There's a spectrum of behavior all the way from, self-service across to service to others. It's a long, 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 long spectrum. It's from narcissism to compassion, or from service to self to service to others. Every single soul is going to have to land somewhere on that spectrum at various stages of its life. Its center of gravity will hover over a particular part. Now, we start off as little infants, and the only thing we can do for ourselves basically is breathe. And so there's a huge need to land on the service to self's end of the spectrum. Otherwise, we would not survive infancy. So we have to land at that place in order even to survive. But as we grow, we're supposed to move along that spectrum until finally we wind up as enlightened beings in service to other, because we realize the other is me. There is only God. So we need to march along that place. So what happens is, if I get stuck on the service to self, then service to self morphs into selfishness. And then selfishness morphs into greed. And then greed morphs into fear, anxiety, anger, and then finally violence. And that's when evil is born. There's no pre-existing evil. It's not like God created 2 possibilities and said, I'm giving you free will and I'm giving you 2 choices. You can choose the light or you can choose the dark. The dark did not exist. The dark is an emergent, quality that proceeds from sticking and living at one end of the spectrum of service to self or service to others. And so I've tried to unpack it with a few of the images I've used. So the first one I used was a jigsaw puzzle. You take a jigsaw puzzle, you go down to a shop and you buy a jigsaw puzzle. Imagine it's a huge one, there's 10,000 pieces in it. The first thing you have to make an act of faith that when you tumble all the pieces onto the table, that every piece that's there is necessary, and every piece that's necessary is there. You're not going to have to buy some extra pieces to finish the puzzle, and you're not going to have pieces left over when you finish the puzzle. And the image on the box is the face of God. But every soul says, I want to do it myself. I want you to break up the image into 10,000 pieces because I want to assemble it myself. So every soul is given all the pieces, which, if configured correctly, add up to the face of God, but they're broken up into 10,000 discrete, entities. And we set about reassembling them. Now, if we do it correctly, the face of God emerges. If we don't do it correctly, then what will happen is you get a buckled, jigsaw puzzle with big lumps in it, a whole bunch of gaps, and a whole bunch of pieces left over. And no matter where you put those pieces, they don't fit, because you put together pieces that don't actually belong together. And that now is how evil enters the equation. It's not that God said, okay, there's 2 ways of doing this puzzle. There's a right way and there's a wrong way. And as a possibility, here's a buckled version, the wrong way of doing it, and now you can choose between this way or that way. It doesn't work like that. God did not give us 2 versions of the puzzle and said, you can do that one or you can do this one. He gave us all the pieces necessary to recreate the image of God, And if you do it properly, that's what emerges. If you don't do it properly, you get a buckled version. But the buckled version is an emergent reality. It did not exist as a pre-existing condition among which you could choose. The second image I came up with is the water image. Living in East Africa and looking at animals coming to a water hole. All the animals need to drink water. And so a cow and a snake are drinking from the same lake. The cow turns the water into milk through which it feeds its young. And the snake turns it into venom through which it kills its adversaries. But they're drinking the same thing, water. Water is good. It's the stuff of life. So it's the processing of the love that creates the venom or the milk. It's the way we process it. It didn't exist as an evil in its own right before. It was the processing that created the evil. And so, in some senses, the very same thing is true of human beings. It's the way we process our experiences that introduce evil into the world for the very first time. God did not create it as a pre-existing possibility that you could choose if you wanted it in order to exercise your free will. The third image I came up with was the touch of the Master's hand. It was my grandfather's favourite poem. He would recite it regularly. And the story very simply is, there's an old battered violin being auctioned off, and the auctioneer holds it and says, "Upon my bid for this violin." And somebody says, $2. 2? Will somebody give me 3? Tom? $3? Okay, $3. Okay. Joe? 4? You go 4? 4? Anybody go 5? No? No? 5? 5? Any advance of 5? No? He's just about to sell it to Jane. And all of a sudden, an old man comes stumbling up from the back of the room. He said, "Can I just play a tune in it?" He said, "Sure." So he takes it and he creates heavenly music. And people are in tears. And finally he gives it back to the auctioneer. And the auctioneer puts up and he says, "What am I bid for this violin?" And Jane says, 5,000. Yeah. And so he says, "I'll make it 6. And Johanna says, "Make it 7. So what made the difference? A violin is created to midwife great music. And in the hands of a master, it creates great music. You give it to an amateur, and they'll create cacophony. Cacophony did not exist as a pre-existing condition, among which you could choose. It was the kind of the inability of the guy with the fiddle that created the cacophony. So evil is not a pre-existing entity, made by God. And the fourth image I came up with is, take art. Take some great artist, and maybe, Renaissance artists like Fra Angelico, who did some extraordinary canvases. And the palette of colours available to him was available to everybody else. But I warned you that there were hundreds of artists in his time who created very blah visual images using the same palette of colours, or even really kind of repugnant images. It's just the guy with the person with the brush in their hands. That's the one that creates the beauty or the visual anomalies. And so finally then, the word emergent is key here. In science, an emergent reality is something that comes out of previous factors which had not yet been combined. And there is no way, if you look at the individual factors, that you could predict that the unification of these two factors would produce something radically different. And I gave the example of water. So you had hydrogen molecules and oxygen molecules existing for billions of years before they decided to mate and to marry and to dance. And now you've got a third thing which you would never have guessed. It's called water. It's an emergent reality that previously didn't exist and couldn't have been predicted from the constituent elements. So the total is much greater than the sum of the parts. Or take the story of Timothy McVeigh. Whether or not he actually did it or he was framed or whatever, for purposes of the illustration, here was somebody who on the 19th of April 1995 allegedly took two, kind of innocuous substances, ammonium nitrate and nitromethane fertilizer, combined them and created a bomb that killed 168 people. So, left to their own devices, none of them would have done this on their own. Combined, this is what they could affect. And so I want to really re-emphasize that, my real belief system is this. God did not create evil and throw it into the cauldron of human experience or incarnation in order to separate the wheat from the chaff. God created only love. And when we learn how to live in love, evil evaporates. Evil came into being only because we were unable to engage in service to other, unable to recognize the namaste, this great Hindu, prayer. Namaste. The divine inside in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. When you operate from that place, evil dissolves.